This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. Now, this is a topic today that I just love. It's so appropriate, so perfect timing for today's world. The title of the book, Backable: The Surprising Truth Behind What Makes People Take a Chance on You. The author, serial entrepreneur, and on the faculty at Harvard University, Suneel Gupta. Suneel makes the case. No one makes it alone. But there's a reason some people can get investors or bosses to believe in them while others can't. Guess what? That reason has little to do with experience, pedigree, or a polished business plan. You see, backable people seem to have a hidden quality that inspires others to take action. So here's the next question. Is this innate? Are you born with it? Or can you learn it? Now, anyone that knows something about my background and something about my belief set and something about how I have been influenced knows damn straight that I come down on the side of you can learn it. So look, at the end of the day, everyone wants to be backable. Everyone wants to have the support to go make something happen. I give Suneel a lot of credit, a great title, a great idea to go down this path. Without any further delay, let's jump right into Suneel's lessons that he's pulled from hundreds of the world's biggest thinkers. Because let's face it, if we can all save a little time because some bright guy has done the work for us and we can learn without having to learn it ourselves, damn, that's a good day. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Suneel Gupta. I've had a lot of pitches for book ideas. People, they say, hey, Mike, check this book out. And a lot of books recently from very accomplished authors, academics, etc., are often very narrow. At least it feels narrow to me. They want to focus on telling the audience how to get a job. I'm paraphrasing, but a lot of that, maybe from even people you know. What I like about what you've done is instead of going down that path, you are taking it to the mindset, the philosophy, obtain a certain skill set, showing people a window into it. Now, if they want to take what you are telling us all, you can apply it to finding a job, but you can also apply it to a startup or doing a film. I like that mindset so much better. And I think sometimes when I see the books about just getting a job, it feels like it's a little, I've got to do this for marketing reasons. So I salute you for keeping it at the philosophical level.
Thanks for saying that. I mean, first of all, you embody, I think, a lot of what we're talking about in this book because you have been inside the room across all of these different situations. You're a filmmaker, you've produced things before, you've created new ideas from scratch, you've certainly applied for jobs. You understand that this it quality that we're really after, something that can be useful no matter what. It can even be useful with friends and family. What I was trying to figure out with this book is that there are some people who seem to have the ability to do this very, very well. They shine in these key moments, including interviews and meetings, auditions, pitches, and sometimes even when they're not the obvious choice. We still want to take a chance on them. For example, Lady Gaga had a producer take a chance on her after she was dumped by Def Jam Records. Investors took a chance on Jeff Bezos, even though he did not have an entrepreneurial track record. He had zero experience with books. There's a long set of examples. What I was trying to figure out is, could this it quality be learned? Even if we're not a celebrity or a CEO, how do we convince a hiring manager? How do we convince a team? How do we convince an investor to take a chance on us?
Do you think Jeff and Lady Gaga knew about what you have pulled together as they were undergoing their process? Do you think they already understood there's going to be a lot of no's and a lot of no's and a lot of no's, and they had the conviction no matter what, they were going to stick with it? Do you think they both had that already? They must have.
I think that they absolutely did know that there were going to be a lot of no's. I think that's one common characteristic that I found amongst backable people, from Oscar-winning filmmakers to celebrity chefs to iconic founders, is I think that there is sort of this acceptance of the fact that not everyone is going to like your idea. And that's okay, because what you really need is just a few people who love the idea. If you get a no, there's always another room. And I think that that is a mindset that either backable people had from the beginning, or it's something that they learned to have over time. You used a really important word, Michael, which is conviction. Because when I first started writing this book, I thought that people who tend to have this it quality were going to have a certain way of speaking. They were going to have a certain way of communicating, certain hand gestures, eye contact. They were going to make use of all the things we hear are really important when it comes to public speaking or communication. But I actually did not find that. I found that backable people have their own communication style. Some are introverts, some are much more extroverted. But the thing that binds them together is really a sense of conviction. It's not really charisma that convinces people, it's conviction. And the reason that's important is because oftentimes we run out and we share our ideas before we're actually ready, before we've actually built that conviction ourselves. What I found is that taking the time to convince yourself first before you try to convince others is such an important part of the formula.
Well, first off, let me say this word. Let me ask you about the word backable. At some point in time, I've dealt with 3 or 4 different publishers on a handful of books. At some point in time, you had to convince somebody at the publisher that this word backable should be in the title. Now, for someone like me and a lot of other people listening, they're going to be like, oh, clever, cool, I get it, instantly, boom, you want to be backable. But I'm wondering, were there people in the publishing world that were kind of like, oh, I don't know, we need to clarify this more. We need to make it simpler.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The thing about publishing, or really any creative process, is you're going to have a lot of different voices in the room. I think that oftentimes people will want to opinion and bring in their own fingerprints just for the sake of having it on their idea, being able to be part of it. And I think that's okay. But certainly people in the room were not a fan of a word that isn't widely understood.
Probably not widely used, really, at least.
And widely used, yeah.
In large public conversations, probably behind the scenes, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the thing that kind of got everybody over the hump, the thing that really sort of excited me about it, is this is not just for celebrities and CEOs. We can all use a little bit of that it quality right now. Like you said in the beginning, Michael, like, it's for people who are looking for jobs, but it's also for people who are looking to make a change. The amount of evidence out there, there's a mountain of data out there showing that the vast majority of us are disengaged with what we do every day. We're looking to make a change. And I think this pandemic has given us anything. It's given us a little bit of a space to kind of realize that waiting for change is no longer an option. If you're not happy where you are, there really is no time like the present to figure out something new, to make a difference. I think that's true for your ideas. That's true for the job you have. That's true for really anything.
I'll give you one to play with. I started on a film script, theatrical release a few years ago. And as I started it, living in Vietnam at that point in time for 6 years, I was writing a script about Vietnam, especially the modern aspects of Vietnam. What I've come to love and know, which I would say the average American has zero understanding about. I've got to do this because there's been 186 films on the Vietnam War. 186. That's nutso. I said to myself, I'm going to write a film that doesn't touch on war at all because no one here touches on it. It's the Buddhist mindset that's gone. They're not thinking about it anymore. I ended up meeting somebody, a quite famous actress, and I realized when I was asking her about her reception in Hollywood when they find out she's Vietnamese, and she's like, well, you know, all the Hollywood executives, and she starts miming machine gun fire and saying guns, jungles, bombs. And I just realized I had to go through this process to then say, well, gosh, I can't do a film without mentioning the war, but I wasn't going to go down the same old thing. I had to come at it from a completely different perspective. This is getting at what you're talking about with the conviction. If I didn't spend the time on the ground, if I didn't incubate this thing, and it didn't happen overnight, there's a lot of starts and stops. There was a lot of people reading scripts saying, Mike, you're on the wrong path. But this is kind of where you're going, is you're telling people like, look, there's no quick fix here. If you want to make something big happen, you have to have some conviction about it. And I only relay the story that I just kind of briefly said, just to let people know that I'm going through this myself. You got to live and breathe it. You got to kind of get in there and you got to get dirty, and there's going to be mistakes. And then on the other side of that, you go into this in your book. On the other side of that, you can get conviction. And then when you have conviction, you can give it to other people.
Such a good point. And I love that example as well, because you're no stranger to what we're talking about here in this book. You've talked in your podcast about how you wanted to go work on Wall Street, but you didn't know a soul. And you convinced the retired head of Solomon Brothers to come meet with you while you guys had lunch and talk to him. And you're no stranger to this. And you're taking that, and I think you're using it across these different fields. Filmmaking is one of them. I think one of the things that we're bringing up with conviction is that we often, I think, go out and rush out and share our ideas. One of the things I found when I was looking at the way ideas percolate inside companies, how does a junior level employee get an idea made? One of the things I found is that most ideas inside companies, just as an example, they don't get killed inside conference rooms. Most ideas actually get killed inside the hallways. They get killed around water coolers, or right now in the world we're in, they get killed on casual conversations over Zoom, not necessarily formal pitches. And what that tells me is that oftentimes that's because we go out and we share our idea before it's ready to be shared. And that's not to say that you need to just hold on to ideas, because that's its own problem, which is that we don't get it out there. But at the same time, we do need to take the time to really, I think, bake our idea just a little bit before we actually put it out into the world. I think the thing that we realize in writing this book is that ideas are fragile. That's any idea. An idea for a new process, an idea for a new product, they're fragile when they're first born, when you first think of them. And if you go out there and you share it immediately and you sort of get that mixed reaction that we can get where someone's like, interesting idea, that can be really deflating. What tends to happen in those situations is that when we don't get that positive reinforcement that we're looking for, we're excited, but they're not as excited, we tend to sort of just put the idea away and we don't really pick it back up.
Yeah, it's a great point. I watched a documentary the other day on the early days of Amazon. There was no guarantee that was going to work. Not at all. There was no guarantee. It looks great now in hindsight. In the early stages, Jeff was the only one that knew it was going to work,
Yeah. So many of these ideas that we feel are obvious now, not obvious at the time. People did pass on Amazon. They did pass on Instagram. They passed on Google, SpaceX. The list goes on and on. The thing is that when you're running with anything new, and that could be a career switch, the idea that I want to go have a new career, like you said, you have to be prepared for all the no's that are coming your way, which is why building this conviction is just so important. When you know that you're going to be on the receiving end of doubt, the receiving end of rejection, but you've built that conviction yourself, now you're actually prepared.
Let me let you go back in time a little bit so people have some understanding about how you came to have the conviction to do this book. Let me take you to a particular point in time in your life. I don't know the exact year, but I sure remember at least the enthusiasm, and the enthusiasm was off the charts. There was a little company called Groupon. This was a beast. This thing took off. I mean, everybody was involved with this, either trying to have their business channel through it or the IPO, everything. You were there. Tell that story. Tell about how you ended up there. Let people understand some of what was going on there in the early stages of yourself.
At the time, I was working at a company called Mozilla, which makes Firefox. And I was working on the product development side of the company. I was introduced to Andrew Mason, who was the founder and CEO at that time of a company called The Point. Point was the predecessor to Groupon, early version of Kickstarter or GoFundMe. Same idea of the tipping point. They were starting to find at the company was that it was starting to work pretty well for small businesses. And eventually that pivoted to Groupon. And a lot of people didn't know that. It was running out of funding as The Point, but they found this thing that seemed to be working. And in the last act of The Point, they shifted over to this new business model. And that's around the time that I was introduced to Andrew. And I flew out to Chicago. I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I flew out to Chicago. It was a small company. It was a small startup, hadn't raised Series A funding. There were 50 or so people working there, mostly working on sales. They had expanded from Chicago to Boston at that point, working in two cities. What I remember the most about that interview, that conversation when I spoke to Andrew, was that he was completely focused on the central character that they were really trying to serve. It was the small business owner. By that point in time, the startup press, tech press was already excited about the company. This was something that was working. It was something that could really take off. But Andrew wasn't really focused on that. He was just focused on like, who is this one person that we're trying to serve? We actually didn't spend much time inside the office. He and I walked around Chicago, and he would point out these restaurants and these shops and these studios, and he would tell me their stories. That person over there, he'd point to a bakery. He'd say, Jim over there didn't open that bakery because he loves marketing or he loves customer acquisition. He opened up that shop because he loves to bake. Ultimately, the reason that Groupon exists right now is because we want to help that person. We want to help him be able to do what he loves. I remember just leaving Chicago, getting on a flight, and just thinking to myself, I have to work here. I have to work with this guy. His passion for this one central character was just so apparent and important. Went home, convinced my wife to move to Chicago, and we started our journey there. To answer your question about what was the journey like from that point on, and we grew from at that point, 50 or so employees to close to 15,000 by the time that I left. We went from a small startup to a large public company. Along the way, I think that the pressure to stop focusing on that central character and start focusing on the numbers, start focusing on quarterly earnings, start to focus on Wall Street rather than Main Street, just became so overwhelming that I think, again, that one person that we're trying to serve, we really lost sight of that. As a result of that, I think the company in the short term did well, but in the long term, I think had its struggles. Small businesses were no longer getting the value that they needed out of it. Employees didn't really feel like they had really central mission to kind of rally around. We lost some of our good people, and we lost Andrew himself, our CEO.
This casting of a central character, you have another example with someone who's been on this show, and he influenced me about a decade ago as well. This would be Tim Ferriss. Talk about the example with Tim and his notion of the central character. That was very clever. I've never heard him say it like that. A very interesting insight that you pulled together.
Part of the reason that I wrote this book is because I needed it. I am not a naturally backable person. I'm not the kind of person that naturally walks into a room and people are like, wow, I really want to take a chance on that person. I really wanted to study people who had this it quality because I wanted to see if I could get a little bit of it myself. And one of the people that I ended up pitching on my startup idea, which was getting rejected by every investor that I ever pitched, was Tim Ferriss. With Tim, what I pitched him on, I'll just give you a quick 1 minute on my idea. It was called Rise, and it was a one-on-one nutrition coaching company. You were matched with the personal nutritionist right over your mobile phone. And the way that my pitch sort of looked is that I shared all the numbers first. I talked about the rising numbers of diabetes and hypertension and obesity. And then at the very end of my pitch, I shared a story. And the story was of my father, who had his first triple bypass surgery when he was in his 40s. And what ended up happening was that when we were leaving the hospital, we received a piece of paper. And that piece of paper had all the things we needed to be doing differently with our lifestyle. And it had the things you might expect. It said, eat broccoli, eat Brussels sprouts. We were an Indian family. We didn't eat broccoli. We didn't really eat Brussels sprouts. That wasn't part of our diet. It wasn't until we ended up getting the help of a nutritionist that we were able to really customize our lifestyle to make it work for my father's health. And thankfully, he was able to live much, much longer than people thought he would. When I shared that story with Tim, he looked at me and said, why did you say that story to the end? Why don't you tell that story in the beginning and then talk about the numbers, talk about the market share, all the data behind it, but share that story first. What he shared with me was that when he wrote the 4-Hour Workweek, he was turned down by 25 publishers in a row. 25. We're talking about one of the best-selling business books in modern times, and it was turned down by 25 publishers. But he got a piece of advice, and the piece of advice was, why don't you rewrite the book for just one friend? Instead of trying to write for a mass market, choose one person and write the book for them. And when he did, the writing became so much sharper that publishers ate it up, and since then it's sold tens of millions of copies. He said, take the same advice that I got and apply it to your pitch. share your father's story first and then talk about the numbers. Because here's the thing, we emotionally connect to people, not to numbers. Stories are what draw us in, and numbers are what actually keeps us there. When you're going into a room for whatever cause, for an interview, for a pitch, think to yourself, who is your central character? Who is that one person that you're trying to serve, or the company that you want to work for is trying to serve? Have one person in mind. Tell that person's story clearly, and then you can shift over to the numbers.
Can you tell the story to yourself almost? I'm thinking to myself, because as I was been working on a script in the last couple of years, I almost feel like I've been writing it to myself. I mean, I want to convince myself of what I've figured out.
For me, I wrote Rise for the younger version of myself. I talk about in the book about how I interviewed for a dream job with Jack Dorsey when he was starting Square. I really wanted that job. I felt qualified for that job. I had passed through the screenings. There were other people who interviewed me before I got to Jack. I walked into that interview and I completely tanked it. Completely tanked it. He asked me relatively easy questions. He was warm, he was humble, and he asked me, I think, pretty softball questions. How do you think about product development? I had worked in product development by that point in time for several years. I had led product teams, I had written product papers. But for whatever reason inside that room, I could not take what was inside my head and explain it in a coherent way, a memorable way. I did not get that job. I continued as I was writing this book to go back to that moment and to say to myself, what did I need? What did I really need in that moment? So yeah, I think oftentimes the central character that we have in mind is ourselves.
I remember meeting a lot of really interesting, quite accomplished, you mentioned one earlier, a guy named Jim Massey at Salomon Brothers, but a lot of these really interesting folks in my mid to late 20s, early 30s. At that time, I guess for a few of them, I probably would have loved to have taken a job next to the billionaire, famed Wall Street trader. But I realized after a while that there was a blinking light on my forehead. And the blinking light, it took me a long time to realize this, but the blinking light said, why should I hire you? You don't want to be an employee. I didn't know that blinking light was there, but I now know for sure it's there.
You had this sense you didn't really want it, that you weren't all in for what you were trying to get going.
I mean, maybe they looked at me and they thought, this guy's got stepping stones going through his mind, but they realized I was just not going to be an employee. He was going to be happy just to be an employee. I don't think you would have been either, which is why I'm bringing that story up, because look at all the different things that you have gone through to back. Ultimately, even if you thought you wanted that job with Jack Dorsey at Square, maybe you really didn't want it at that point in time.
It's a good point, because I think we were talking before about how to build conviction in an idea that cuts in two different ways. And one is that, why is this idea good for the market, or why is it good for the company? And then the second is, why is this idea good for you? Does it really match you, who you are? And there's a story that I really loved, and it was a mentor of mine who shared it with me. And the reason she shared it is because when I was leaving Groupon, I wanted to start my own thing. I wanted to run with my own company. What I did is I went through this very business school analyst exercise where I put all of my ideas in a spreadsheet. The first column were the ideas, but then the remaining columns were all the things you might expect. It was market size and competition and all the things you kind of expect from more of an analysis. And then I walked into this meeting with her and I shared this spreadsheet of ideas. I said, hey, here are all the things I'm sort of thinking about. And she looks at the spreadsheet, she looks at me and she says, which of these ideas actually makes you come alive? And I look at the spreadsheet and I realize that none of them really do. None of them really made me come alive. None of them set me on fire. I thought they were good ideas.
You were a smart person that could put it all down, but they weren't really moving you. They weren't driving you. There was no passion.
Exactly. She's like, let me tell you a story. I mean, this is a story I'll never forget. She's like, when Martin Luther King was in his early 30s, a lot of people don't realize this, but he was very, very young when he became the leader of the civil rights movement. He was in his early 30s. There were a lot of other people who were sort of qualified for that role, but the idea was, hey, you got this young, charismatic leader that people really admire, and he can really take this on. He went to his mentor, a guy named Howard Thurman, and he asked him whether he should really step into this. What he shared with Howard Thurman is, look, I think this is something that the world really needs. And his mentor looks at him and he says, don't ask just what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive. Because what the world really needs is more people who have come alive.
That's so good. That's such good advice. All we have to do, it doesn't make a difference if I speak to America, it doesn't make a difference whether one is on the left or the right. Right now, there is like there's a dearth. There is a lack of people coming alive. There are too many people staring at the screens, expecting the screens to make them come alive. They've forgotten how to come alive. They don't even know where to go to start.
Yeah, yeah. I think of it almost sort of like a pilot light where it's like you can hear that tick, 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 but there's no flame. I think that so many of us know how that feels. I know that I have been in points in my career where I certainly know how that feels, where it's like, yeah, I'm showing up to my desk. Yeah, I'm at my screen. I'm doing the work, but the flame isn't there anymore. Again, I think if the pandemic has given us anything, I think for a lot of us, at least, those of us who have been fortunate enough to have some space, have been able to kind of realize that what that feels like isn't what we want. We need to make a change.
You know something, to go back in time, I don't know your exact age, but to go back in time, I remember putting a website up in 1996, my first website. Having this conversation with you, and I think back to 96, 97, 98, 99, obviously things blew up in early 2000. But you know what? That time was exciting. Exciting as you know what, because people were trying things. There weren't just 5 big tech companies that controlled everything. Anybody had a chance. It was really, really exciting. And I think we've not had that kind of excitement, that kind of business entrepreneurial excitement has not been, people can say, well, gosh, we got crypto. No, not the same, not the same. Very narrow in many ways. I love the idea of where you're going with the notion of being backable and ideas and creating. And you've got this great thing you say in the book where it's like Google search. Google search. Come on, if people are using a Google search to come up with their ideas, man, everyone can do that. Speak to the Google search mentality. It's a real problem, isn't it?
One thing that I think is so important, no matter what room you're walking into or who you're speaking to, is to share an earned secret. Share an earned secret. And that's something that you have found through firsthand experience, something that you've done by putting yourself into the story and really finding a detail, an insight that most people who are in your shoes may not know. When I was interviewing Brian Grazer for this book, Brian Grazer is a Hollywood producer, but he also invests in tech companies and he runs large teams. When I was in his waiting room in Beverly Hills, there were people, and it was a crowded room. People were pitching him on everything. When I went back there and talked to him, I said to him, look, you've got a room full of people out there that are waiting to pitch you on their idea. If I could go out there right now and I could give them one piece of advice, one thing, what would it be? Thinks about it for a moment and he says, give me something that I can't find on Google. Give me something that's not Googleable. What I realized is that that's a characteristic that I think most decision makers, I think, tend to have in the back of their mind. They're looking for something different. They're looking for something that's insightful, not just the idea, but the insight that went into the idea. What I've realized is that how you arrive on an idea can be as memorable and important as the idea itself. I'll give you an example from just when I was pitching my company. One of the things I did to find customers for my service, Rise, is I would stand outside of Weight Watchers meetings. And as people were right about to enter, I would say, hey, would you mind if I gave you just a demo of this new app I'm working on? That's how I signed up my first customers. Now, that's not a very sophisticated answer to the question of how did you find your first customer. So I would hardly ever tell that story in the beginning when I was pitching investors. It was overly basic. But what I found over time is that ended up being the story. That ended up being the part of the pitch that investors ended up enjoying the most. Even though it wasn't very Silicon Valley, it wasn't very techy, it didn't have a sophisticated sort of nature to it, but they liked that part of the story. And I think the reason that they did is because it showed a higher level of effort. It was me going out there beyond Google, from beyond my desk, and getting insights myself. I'll give you just one more example because this just happened the other day. There was a woman who was applying for a job at a social media company. She didn't use their product. It wasn't a service that she used, but she was very interested in the job. But what she did is she went out and she interviewed all of her daughter's friends, every single one of them, asked them what they liked about the service, what they didn't like about the service. And then she had them send her screenshots of these moments in their experience where they felt like they wanted something a little bit different. And she took all of that with her into the interview. Even though she wasn't a user of the product up until that point, she had collected all these insights. The person who she was looking at, this was over Zoom, felt intoxicated with effort. She was just intoxicated by what she had done to go out and find these insights herself. When you're going into a room, don't just go to Google. Like you say, Michael, like talk to customers, test drive the product, attend shareholder talks, watch interviews with the executives. Go find these insights that I think most people don't try to get before they go into the room.
You just said something which is intoxicating by effort. The tough thing, people understand conceptually what you mean, but to be intoxicated by effort, that's tough for a lot of people because you've got to do something and you've got to love doing something. And it's not necessarily a job. You're not necessarily getting paid for it. You don't necessarily have any guarantee of any kind of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but you've still got to be so engaged that you almost look psychopathic about your conviction of the idea. That's a really interesting thing for the average person with the typical global education today, where the typical global education, as you know, you mentioned your family heritage. I know across Asia, so many young kids, especially India, Southeast Asia, and China, we've got some of the smartest people in the world. A lot of that is rote memorization. There's a pivot at some point in time in life where they can use all that rote memorization. How do you get people to be motivated, to be intoxicated by doing something where there's no damn guarantee?
Yeah. I think it's such an important point. You have to find that reward from the work itself rather than the outcome and the consequences. We're at the beginning of the year right now, and I talk to a lot of people about goals. And one of the things I learned as I was writing this book was that I think life is not a to-do list. It's really a to-learn list. And when I was writing this book and I was thinking about writing this book, I could have had a goal of, I want to write a book. I want to write a best-selling book. That's probably the type of goal I would have put down on paper a few years ago. But after writing this book and seeing how backable people work, I think most people who are, I think what we would consider to be big thinkers and have had success in their lives, they're really in the work for the work itself. Then they treat it much more like a to-learn list. Like they really throw themselves into the process. They're not as worried as much about the outcome. And that's not to say they don't have a vision. It's not to say that they don't care. But it's to say that they're finding work where the reward itself is coming from just the process of the work itself. When you find that, even if that's for preparing for something, preparing for a job interview, if the goal is instead of like, I'm going to land the job, it's I'm going to learn everything I can. Like I really want to get deep on what's happening at that company.
What you're saying right now, why do we not say this starting in high school in the States? Why do we not say this in college? Why do we keep up this thing that there's this magical employer to give you a magical job? Why do we not let people understand what you just said is the real truth to life and frankly, the real chance to get some happiness? Because I guess if some young person just goes through life saying, well, gosh, let me get the 1400 on the SATs. Let me get to Harvard. Let me get out. Let me work for some consulting company. You gain about 30 pounds in your 20s and 30s. You get to be 40. You look around. You're like, what the hell? I mean, when do we start to say what you just told me to young people? When do we start that?
What's amazing about it is that it's not new. The idea of detachment from the outcome, to devote ourselves to the process, these are concepts that are thousands and thousands of years old. I mean, I learned about it as a kid when I was studying the Bhagavad Gita at the temple in suburban Michigan. But at the same time, it's not just an Eastern philosophy thing either. You have Mihai Csikszentmihalyi in his book Flow talked about the difference between autotelic and exotelic. And what he found is that autotelic is people who are doing the work for work's sake. Exotelic is when you're doing the work for a consequence, for an outcome. What he found is that people who are able to get into a state of flow, people who are able to really, I think, achieve high performance, tend to have autotelic personalities. They have an autotelic process. They're focusing on the work for the work's sake, but not necessarily for the outcome. When I share this idea, typically, I think most people see this as, again, sort of an Eastern concept. Immediately, it can kind of go to the meditation yoga world, but it's not. It's very much rooted in Western science. If you listen to LeBron James even talk about how he is an athlete, What's the LeBron mindset? Someone asked him the other day. He said, I'll tell you what the LeBron mindset is. I focus on the process and I forget about the outcome. It's not that I don't want to win, but when I'm in the game and when I'm training, I'm never thinking about the trophy.
Now, if people start to understand where you're going to be backable, then people quickly come up against a constraint, at least one in their mind. And that constraint being, oh my gosh, I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to be afraid. I don't want to look bad. I ended up in a situation, just to share with you really quickly, I ended up in front of Vietnam's most famous fashion designer last week, and we were having a conversation about this film project. I mean, look, I'm a little bit older and I've got some experience at this in my early 50s. People can tell I sound a little bit, I'm not shy for confidence. But we started talking, me and this lady, and she wanted to know how I would understand, me as the white guy in Southeast Asian country, would understand relationships and whatnot. And I said, well, 2 failed engagements. And that just bust her up. She just loved that I had no problem in the snap of her fingers telling her exactly how I came to have this knowledge. And I think that's hard for people because I didn't think about it at the moment. You can tell, I'm amped up. But at that moment, I was just like, well, of course, this is why I know, because these 2 relationships. But I think a lot of people, they want to keep those things secret. And you've talked about this so far in our conversation, that those little nuggets that we might think about our process that are not so interesting to the people that we are pitching to, the people we are talking to, the people that we want to back us, they love that stuff.
They do. And I think you're bringing up such an important point, which is that long-term success often comes from short-term embarrassment. We have to have those failures. We have to have those rejections, I think, in order to get to where we want to go. One of the things we talk about in the book is that you have to have a circle of people around you as well, who you can go to, a small group of trusted people who you can start to test your ideas with, who you can start to share your ideas with and really practice and hone what it is you're about to do before you go out and do it in a live event or the main event. And I call these exhibition matches, playing exhibition matches. And what I found is that there are 4 different types of people that you want to play these exhibition matches with, 4 different types of people who tend to be in your circle. And those 4, I call them the 4 C's. The first is your collaborator. This is somebody who is building on top of your ideas. When you're with this person, you feel like you're in a musical jam session. They're constantly saying yes and building, building, and building. The second is your coach. We've been talking about this. Coach is somebody who is not just going to tell you whether your idea is good for the market, but whether your idea is good for you. Maybe this is before you went and met with Solomon Brothers. And it's like, hey, do you really want this job? Is this something you're really after? And your coach is somebody who knows you intimately well enough to be able to say, you know what, I think this is maybe a good idea for someone else, but not for you. It doesn't seem to fit you. The third C is your cheerleader. Your cheerleader is somebody who's going to build you up right before you go into the room. This isn't somebody who's necessarily going to riff on your idea with you, but they love you and they're going to want to tell you how great you are before you get into the room. And I think we actually really need that, as cheesy as it might sound. Ellen Levy was named one of the most connected women in Silicon Valley by Fast Company magazine. And her Rolodex is massive, members of Congress, Fortune 500 CEOs. And I asked her before she walks into a room to give a pitch, who does she call? And she said, I call my mom. That's your third C, is your cheerleader. And the fourth C is your critic. We talked about the collaborator, coach, cheerleader, and the fourth is your critic. But I have another name for critic. I call this person your cheddar. Your cheddar. Because if you've ever seen the movie 8 Mile, Eminem in the movie is surrounded by a circle of friends who are constantly sort of building him up. But he's got one friend named Cheddar who is always poking holes in his ideas. But what we learn throughout the film is that it's Cheddar who really helps get Eminem prepared for the main stage. So this is that annoying friend who's always saying, yeah, but what about that? Or they're always kind of poking holes in your ideas. But that is the person who really gets us ready to be in the room. Because when we get inside a room, we know that oftentimes the job of a good backer is to ask us the tough questions, to really poke the holes in the ideas. We need to have answers for that. We need to anticipate it and get ahead of it. Having a cheddar in your life who you appreciate is really important.
Those 4 C's, they're not necessarily easy. It's not necessarily easy to have those all at the same time with, let's say, equal talented C who can really give what you need. But I conceptually, I don't see how anyone can argue. It's all terribly important to find at least those things in some way. They're mandatory almost.
I think you're right. When you find people who fit these roles, you really have to nurture these relationships. It's become tougher, I think, when we're physically separated at the moment to really, I think, stay in touch, stay connected. But I think nurturing these relationships, even when you're not in the middle of giving a pitch, you're not out there applying for a job, but just staying connected to people who are part of this circle, just being really deliberate about it. It's amazing what a commonality that has been across Backable People is that they have a small go-to trusted group. It's almost like a Jedi council that they constantly go to. And you're right, they're not always easy people to find. But when you find them, stay connected to them, nurture those relationships, don't let them go.
Let's talk about noise for a moment. I feel lucky to be living in a country where I don't speak the language and understand very little. It's like a noise reduction. But in the last year, to be an American in America with the COVID situation, with politics, again, whether one is on the left or the right, it's all overkill. It's all overdone. It's all too much. And I think if people want to go down the path, this is my 2 cents, if people want to go down the path to be backable, to come up with the idea, to come up with something, I mean, all that stuff in America has to be turned off. It doesn't help to get there. And the interesting thing from my perspective about COVID, it's giving people a lot of time. I mean, there's a lot of interesting time that's been handed to people. Now, they might be feeling stressed out. They might be feeling, oh my gosh, I don't know what I want to do with my time. But still, it's a unique opportunity, even in a crazy point in history where we are being afforded time to create.
Yeah. When you can't turn off the noise or when the noise seems to be amplified, I mean, I guess you always have the option to at least take a little bit of time every day where you turn off the noise and you be alone. And it's such an important part of the creative process. That's not anything new, but I think it's worth, reminding ourselves that we don't necessarily need to check our phone first thing in the morning. To many people, including me, it is important to stay engaged with what's happening in the world, but that doesn't necessarily need to be that the first thing that I wake up, I need to plug in. Instead, I spend a couple hours every morning now really just focusing on new ideas, nurturing new ideas. And what that has done is by creating a rhythm where every morning I know that time is protected, what it allows me to do is be okay with putting things down on paper that I may not actually use. I know that I'm dedicated these 2 hours anyway. Let me start writing out ideas. Let me start drawing out these ideas. Let me nurture the ones that I have and be okay with the fact that once it gets down on paper, maybe I won't like it as much. And that's okay. Being a writer is something that I've kind of always had in the back of my mind. I've wanted to write a book for a really long time. I remember when I was in law school, it was in Chicago, and Salman Rushdie was passing through town. And he's one of my favorite authors. And he didn't know me, but I cold emailed him several times just saying, hey, you're in town. Could we meet up for just 15 minutes? I'd love to get your advice. And he didn't respond to the first 3 emails, but he responded to the 4th and said, all right, you are persistent. I'm going to be at this location. In between meetings, I'll have about 10 minutes. If you show up there, we can chat. And so I did.
How old were you at that time, roughly?
I was about mid-20s,
Okay.
25.
Okay. It sounded like a mid-20-something act that I had taken before too. I love those things.
Yeah. So I show up, I'm all enthusiastic and got my list of questions. I still remember the look on his face when I asked the first question. It was just this look of disappointment. And what I asked him was, how do you get inspired to write? I remember just seeing the look on his face. I was like, oh my God, another one of these. And he takes some breath and he looks at me and he says, look, I don't get inspired to write. I just write. I sit down at my desk, just like anybody else, 8 a.m., and I write for the entire day until 5 p.m. every day. Most of what I write is not very good. Most of what I write will end up in that trash bin. But every day, there are usually 1 or 2 pearls or 1 or 2 things that I think I can work with. And ultimately, I string together these pearls. Pearls become sentences, and they become paragraphs, and they become pages, and they become books.
Did he say he has to write, though? Which is a little bit different than I write, because he obviously has to write.
He feels like that's who he is. That's what he does. And I do think he feels like he has to write. His point to me was sort of there's no magic behind the process. Because oftentimes I think we feel that action follows motivation. We get really motivated, we get really inspired, and then we act. And I think his point to me, which I've heard many times over again throughout the course of writing this book, is that it's actually the other way around. Motivation follows action. You sit down and you start doing something, and if you get into a rhythm of doing it, the motivation, the inspiration will come.
This is why, like, so many people think I've got to have the passion for some particular project. Well, not necessarily. You could become passionate about running waste management like Wayne Huizenga did years ago and become a billionaire that way. So you never know where the passion is going to come from on whatever subject or topic.
I think that's right. And the only way that you know is through the action, is by sitting down and by doing it. Most of the people that I studied for this book have a warehouse of throwaway work, warehouses of work that they did that they never really shared with anybody because they got it down on paper. They did the work to figure out, is this something that I actually want to run with? And they realized it wasn't. And I think that that kind of dispels a real myth, which is that once we get something down, once we've invested the effort, we have to run with it. No, we don't. In fact, getting it down on paper and doing the work is what we need to do in order to know if it actually works. This experience that really stuck with me when I was a kid, I visited my family in India, and they had just gotten their first television set. This was in the mid-'80s, and they'd just gotten their first television set. I didn't know what it was like to introduce a television set to the room because by the time that I was born, we already had a television set. So I grew up around TV. Just to see the look of excitement on my cousins' faces when they got their first television set, black and white, and it had those antennas on it. And the way that it worked is that there was an antenna on the roof that had to keep getting adjusted in order to get the exact right resolution. My cousins and I would run up to the roof and we would actually fix the antenna. It was a flat roof, and we fix the antenna, and then we run back down and see what it looked like on the TV. And we run back up and adjust the antenna again and run back down and see what it looked like. What I found when I was writing this book, it reminded me a lot of that experience because that's kind of the process that Backable people go through. They're constantly running up to the roof, constantly adjusting the antenna, constantly coming back down, looking at their work and saying, hey, do I like it? Is this something that I want to run with? And if not, let me run back up to the roof and adjust it again. It's this constant iteration, but it's iteration to the point where, like, if you don't like it, you can always throw away the work and start new, and that's okay.
I have one last thought from your work that I want you to expand on. I really like this. I tend to have a personal belief that this might be some of the root cause of the ills of my home country. The opposite of success is not failure, it's boredom. I'm really convinced that boredom is so much of the issue that folks, you do such a good job of this with Backable to bring people into all the different insights and the techniques and the mindset. But ultimately what we're trying to fight, I think, is boredom.
Yeah. That's a mantra I think about every day, which is the opposite of success is not failure. It is boredom. I began to learn that near the end of my startup, my last startup, Rise. We ended up selling the company. It was a pretty successful outcome. I think our shareholders were happy. I think the team was happy. But I ended up signing the paperwork for that acquisition with mixed feelings. I felt like we could have been more. I felt like we could have done more. And I remember going to a conference just a few months after the acquisition. I was sitting in the audience. There was somebody up on stage. It was a Fortune conference. Somebody up on stage talking about his healthcare startup. It was this mental health startup that was doing really, really well. And I remember thinking to myself, that feeling of a little bit of envy. I wish I was up on stage. I wish people were asking me about my startup, but they were asking him about his. And at one point in time, he got a question. And the question was, what inspired you? What inspired you to create this company? What inspired this process? He thought about it for a moment, and then he said, one of the companies that inspired me was Rise, my startup. Now, he didn't know that I was in the audience.
Was that the gut feel of, oops, I mean, that would have been mine?
My gut feeling was very positive. It was like, wow, I mean, gosh, we often set out for achieving a certain destination, achieving a certain outcome. But I think the lesson that I learned is that Oftentimes when we don't get to that exact spot that we were trying to get to, we still teach and touch people along the way. When I teach today, I teach students, I ask them, what is it that you want? What is it that you want to have in life? And I think one of the things that they have is, and I think a lot of us do, I think most of us do, is that we want to make a difference. We want to have an impact. Well, sometimes we make an impact not just through what we do directly, but we make an impact through other people. And I think that's the thing, is that even if you fail, you can inspire people along the way. The opposite of success isn't failure, it's boredom is so important, because if you're doing things that matter to you, if you're doing things that sort of make that flame that we've been talking about really light up, the outcome of what happens is part of the story, but so is all the other people who are watching that flame. All the other people who now have the permission to be backable, go do backable things because they're watching you do it.
You know what's so interesting about many of the areas that we've gone today? And you said, okay, you talked about your background, Indian background, and here I am in Southeast Asia. So much of the Buddhist and Hindu culture, but there's a thread going through much of what you're talking about. And I think with a lot of entrepreneurs today, and I've actually seen this in a lot of traders over the years, that if you grow up in the States, you generally are not exposed to Buddhist or Hindu experiences or cultures or philosophies. But there is something really nice about them when it comes to business, when it comes to managing a mindset, when it comes to managing failure. Because it's what you just did. Here I am joking around with you and saying, oops. But the reality is you were already framing it as two sides of the coin and not necessarily trying to put an equal value on either side, and being comfortable to accept the side of the coin that did not go your exact way that you might have mapped out when you first started. That's okay. And that's a little bit different than the way that I would have grown up in the Washington, D.C. area in Northern Virginia when I was a teenager. We didn't have that kind of exposure and whatnot to that certain thinking, that certain philosophical mindset. As I get older, and obviously where I am right now, as I get older, I see it more and more and more. And I think it's terribly important. I do think, though, also, as I give that whole speech there, I think for a lot of people can go right over their head. They still don't kind of really get what it is until they somehow or another find themselves immersed in it. But some of these Eastern traditions that we're generally talking about are really quite fantastic for navigating life.
I feel lucky enough to, I think, have been part of two cultures. My mom was a refugee. I grew up in suburban Michigan. Her story, I think in a lot of ways, I think the basis of this book, I wrote it because I really needed it. But the more I got into it, the more I realized, gosh, this is mom's story. She was a refugee on the border of India and Pakistan. She grew up with no running water, no electricity. But along the way, she found a book. That book was the biography of Henry Ford. Somehow she got it planted in her mind that one day she wanted to move to Detroit, Michigan, and become an engineer with Ford Motor Company. Her parents got behind the dream. They saved every penny that they had, and they got her on a boat, and she came to the United States. She was lucky enough to get a scholarship. She drives to Detroit, Michigan the day after she graduates. She applies for a job. But the thing about it, though, is that this was the 1960s. While Ford Motor Company had thousands of engineers, it was really a company in its heyday. Not a single one of those engineers was a woman.
Literally not one.
Not a single female engineer working at the company at that point. The hiring manager, I think he thought that she was applying for a different role. And when he realizes that she's applying for the job of an engineer, he looks at her and he looks at paper and he's like, sorry, we don't have any female engineers working here. Pretty deflated. She picks up her resume, puts her purse around her shoulder, begins to walk out of the room. And then in the last moment, she turns around and she looks at him and she tells her story, tells him about the struggle, that everything that had to happen in order for her to be in this room, all the effort that we've been talking about this whole conversation that had to happen in order for her to be where they were. And then she says to him, look, if you don't have any female engineers, then do yourself a favor and give me a shot. Hire me now. And he does. He takes a shot on her. He takes a chance and puts himself out there. And that's how a suburban manager from middle Michigan took a chance on a refugee from the other side of the world.
That's cool stuff.
Yeah, I grew up with that story. Time magazine just wrote a big piece on it last year, but I grew up on it. And The thing that was the coolest about it, though, Michael, was all the people who would come to the house. Phone calls I would overhear of people who would just say thank you, because at the time she didn't get any newspaper articles or anything written about her. It was just kind of one of those things that people knew, and immigrants that were hoping for a better day, women who wanted to do their best inside the workforce and make it in the auto industry. She inspired them. And again, that's why I say, like, look, sometimes even if we don't reach our intended destination, just by taking the path, just by going down the path of the opposite of success isn't failure, it's boredom. Just by adopting that as a mindset and a mantra, you inspire people.
Just so Americans don't think that I'm completely throwing my home country under the bus, let's say something really positive, because you just kind of made the positive story. When it comes to that cowboy risk-taking mentality, what Silicon Valley is all about, that is something that is absolutely the true American, let's just go make it happen spirit. There's all these wonderful Eastern traditions and philosophical mindsets that I've been exposed to. But when it comes to being a risk-taking cowboy, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, I mean, it's still fantastic. However, as I say that also, America should remember one thing. That mentality from America is exporting across the world. I was just reading something the other day where it says like India is absolutely primed to just become an absolute powerhouse because of these types of mentalities infusing the country. If one counts the populations, there is a touch few more people in India than America.
Yeah.
A billion more than a billion. It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, and I see it when I go back and I visit, I spend time with my family and their friends, and I see it. There is an entrepreneurial quality out there that I didn't see 20 years ago. And I think that that's really special. It's no longer you have to sort of follow a very specific career path, but I think people are beginning to realize you can go pursue that idea. You do have the ability, no matter sort of where you live, to, I think, figure out there is a path, at least, to making it happen. That's a really special thing. I mean, I think if we have more people who sort of have the mantra we've been talking about, where the opposite of success isn't failure, it's boredom, ultimately, I think that makes the world a better place.
Lots of opportunity, lots of ways to get there. You do a great job. The book, Backable, the surprising truth behind what makes people take a chance on you. That's what it's all about, right? Because you can't get there alone. It's really tough to get there alone. I don't know too many folks. I mean, there's probably some guy in his underwear somewhere trading $1 billion who got there on his own that he's not going to tell anybody he's trading $1 billion. Maybe one of the Bitcoin guys, right? But that's really rare. The chances of you getting to be the star alone, oof, that's a tough road to sled.
Yeah. I really appreciate you having me on the show. This has been a great conversation.
Hey, I appreciate it. Hey, where can we send people? Where's the best place to drive people? Beyond buying the book at Amazon, all that kind of fun stuff. But where can we send people? What's the website?
Yeah, just go to backable.com.
Cool.
BACKABLE.com.
Hey, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on. And keep me posted. There's always going to be another book. I keep telling this to people. Is this your first one?
This is the first book. Yeah. But there's another one in the works.
I guess this right every time. It's pretty easy to guess. I don't know. So, hey, listen, I appreciate you coming on. Thanks again.
All right, Michael. Thanks so much for having me.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.